What if the one story Donald Trump has tried hardest to bury for years suddenly returned in the most unexpected place? Live on national television with Stormy Daniels sitting across from Jimmy Kimmel. The audience came expecting laughs and light banter. Instead, they got something that felt heavier, more serious, and impossible to look away from. The tension in the studio was electric the moment Jimmy Kimmel introduced Stormy Daniels, and the conversation turned to the controversy that refused to die, no matter how many denials, statements, or attacks Donald Trump issued. Jimmy Kimmel looked straight into the camera and delivered a line that instantly silenced the studio. Tonight, we're talking about a story that has somehow managed to survive every attempt to bury it. The crowd applauded. Jimmy Kimmel continued, "Usually scandals disappear after a few weeks. This one kept collecting lawyers, documents, investigations, and headlines." That earned another wave of applause. Stormy Daniels walked onto the stage to loud cheers. Stormy Daniels smiled, waved, and sat down across from Jimmy Kimmel. There was no dramatic music, no theatrical introduction. The simplicity of the moment made it feel more serious. Everyone watching already knew the basic outline of the controversy. For years, Donald Trump publicly denied having an affair with Stormy Daniels. Meanwhile, reports about a $13,000 payment made through Donald Trump's former attorney, Michael Cohen, had become part of court filings, congressional discussions, criminal investigations, and eventually one of the most closely watched legal cases in the country. That payment had transformed what might have remained a tabloid story into a legal and political controversy. Jimmy Kimmel wasted very little time. So he asked, "Are you surprised we're still talking about this all these years later?" Stormy Daniels laughed quietly. "I think everyone is surprised." The audience laughed with her. Jimmy Kimmel leaned forward because every time people think the story is over, something else happens. Stormy Daniels finished. The audience applauded again. It was an exchange that lasted only seconds, but it perfectly summarized why the controversy refused to disappear. The story kept evolving. Every denial seemed to produce another headline. Every attempt to shut down public discussion appeared to generate fresh questions. Jimmy Kimmel understood that instead of focusing immediately on personal allegations, he shifted towards something viewers could actually verify. Documents, public statements, court records, media interviews, changing explanations. Jimmy Kimmel held up copies of public reporting and said, "People can argue forever about private conversations. What they can't argue about is the paper trail." The audience applauded loudly. That became the central theme of the interview, not speculation, not rumor, records. Jimmy Kimmel reminded viewers that Michael Cohen had publicly admitted arranging the payment to Stormy Daniels before the 2016 election. Cohen later pleaded guilty to several federal offenses, including campaign finance violations related to the payment, though the legal interpretations surrounding those events have remained heavily disputed. Rather than overwhelm viewers with legal language, Jimmy Kimmel simplified the issue. If someone says nothing happened, he said, and then money changes hands to make sure nobody talks about nothing, people naturally start asking questions. The audience laughed. Stormy Daniels smiled but stayed careful. She had spent years answering similar questions. Some interviews had been friendly, others had been openly hostile. Some critics accused her of seeking publicity. Others believed she had been unfairly attacked. No matter where people stood politically, few could deny that her name had become permanently attached to one of the biggest political stories in America. Jimmy Kimmel acknowledged that reality. For years, he said, your name has shown up in campaign coverage, courtroom coverage, cable news, documentaries, probably conversations at Thanksgiving dinner. Stormy Daniels laughed. I'd rather not think about that last one. The audience erupted. The humor helped ease the tension, but the discussion quickly returned to more serious territory. Jimmy Kimmel reminded viewers that Donald Trump had repeatedly described the allegations as false. Donald Trump had consistently denied the affair. Donald Trump had also criticized the investigations, calling them politically motivated and repeatedly arguing that prosecutors were targeting him unfairly. Those public statements had become almost as famous as the controversy itself. Jimmy Kimmel looked directly into the camera. "The interesting part," he said, "is that most scandals fade away because eventually everybody stops talking." He paused. "This one kept surviving because every time someone tried to close the book, another chapter appeared." Stormy Daniels finished. The audience applauded again. It was becoming clear that Jimmy Kimmel was less interested in revisiting old tabloid headlines than in examining why the controversy had remained part of American political life for so many years. Jimmy Kimmel held up another public statement. "This," he said, "is one explanation, then another, and here's another explanation, then another, and somehow none of these explanations ever made the questions disappear." The crowd laughed knowingly. Jimmy Kimmel wasn't presenting himself as a prosecutor. Jimmy Kimmel wasn't pretending to settle legal disputes from behind a late-night desk. Instead, Jimmy Kimmel was pointing out something millions of Americans had noticed themselves. The public narrative had shifted repeatedly over time. First came outright denials, then came reports of payments, then came acknowledgments from Michael Cohen, then investigations, then indictments, then courtroom testimony. Each development seemed to keep the story alive rather than end it. Stormy Daniels watched as Jimmy Kimmel laid the documents across his desk. "There are a lot of papers," she joked. "There really are," Jimmy Kimmel replied. The audience laughed again. Then Jimmy Kimmel delivered the line that immediately changed the atmosphere inside the studio. "People think this story is about one alleged encounter," he said. "I don't." The room became noticeably quieter. "I think it's about what happened afterward." That single sentence shifted the focus entirely because regardless of anyone's opinion about the underlying allegations, the aftermath had become one of the defining political and legal stories of the decade. Investigations, court filings, financial records, campaign questions, public denials, criminal proceedings, everything after the original allegation had grown far larger than the allegation itself. As the applause slowly filled the studio once more, viewers realized this interview was no longer just another late-night conversation. It was becoming an examination of how one controversy had managed to outlast election cycles, court battles, and years of relentless public debate, and why Donald Trump still could not seem to escape it. The conversation had shifted. What began with jokes and familiar late-night humor was now centered on something far more difficult to laugh away. Jimmy Kimmel wasn't trying to convince the audience with dramatic accusations. Instead, Jimmy Kimmel kept returning to the same point over and over again. "The story changes," he said, "but the paperwork stays." That line drew a long round of applause. Stormy Daniels nodded. For years, she had watched the public debate move in circles. One week, the headlines focused on personal allegations. The next week, they focused on legal filings. Then came campaign finance questions, court hearings, sworn testimony, and statements from attorneys. Every new development seemed to create another layer instead of providing a conclusion. Jimmy Kimmel leaned back in his chair. "People often think scandals survive because of rumors," he said. "Sometimes they survive because every answer creates three new questions." The audience laughed, but the point landed. He picked up another stack of publicly available documents and slowly placed them on his desk. "These aren't social media posts," he continued. "These aren't anonymous internet comments. These are public records that became part of one of the most talked about legal stories in the country." Stormy Daniels watched quietly. She knew the attention had long since moved beyond her. What had once been treated as celebrity gossip had become something debated by prosecutors, defense attorneys, political commentators, journalists, and millions of voters. Jimmy Kimmel looked toward her. "When did you realize this wasn't just another headline anymore?" Stormy Daniels paused before answering. "I think it happened when every interview stopped being about me." The audience became noticeably quieter. It became about documents, she continued. Payments, courtrooms, lawyers. Every conversation turned into something much bigger. Jimmy Kimmel nodded, and that's exactly why people kept paying attention. He reminded viewers that public reporting had documented the payment made through Michael Cohen before the 2016 election, a payment that later became central to legal proceedings. Cohen publicly acknowledged arranging the payment and later testified about his role, while Donald Trump continued to deny the underlying allegations and criticize the investigations as politically motivated. Rather than argue the legal details point by point, Jimmy Kimmel focused on the broader picture. If everyone agrees the payment happened, he said, then people naturally ask why. That simple question hung over the studio, not because it answered everything, because it opened the door to everything else. Stormy Daniels smiled slightly. I've heard that question for years. And have you ever stopped hearing it? Jimmy Kimmel asked. She shook her head. Not once. The audience applauded. Jimmy Kimmel turned back toward the camera. This is where people often get confused, he explained. There are really two separate conversations. He raised one finger. One is about what happened between two people. Then he raised another. The other is about what happened after everyone started talking about it. He let that distinction settle. The second story, he said, is the one that kept getting bigger. The audience responded with another round of applause. Jimmy Kimmel continued the interview with the same calm intensity. Jimmy Kimmel reminded viewers that the controversy surrounding the payment had evolved far beyond celebrity news. It had become the subject of investigations, court proceedings, sworn testimony, and constant political debate. Regardless of where someone stood politically, few could argue that it had remained one of the most closely watched stories in recent American politics. Jimmy Kimmel smiled. At this point, I think every cable news producer has a permanent folder labeled Stormy. The audience burst into laughter. Stormy Daniels couldn't help laughing too. I've probably helped a few ratings. You've helped a lot of ratings, Jimmy Kimmel joked. The humor lightened the mood, but only for a moment. Jimmy Kimmel became serious again. I think there's something people forget. He paused. When a story stays in the headlines for years, everyone involved pays a price. Stormy Daniels nodded. That's true. She explained that many people assumed public attention was glamorous. It isn't. She described years of interviews, criticism, online attacks, public speculation, and endless media attention. No matter where I went, she said, someone wanted to ask about the same story. The audience listened carefully. There are days when you just want your own name back. The room fell silent. Jimmy Kimmel let that statement sit for several seconds. That's something viewers probably don't think about enough. He explained that political scandals often become entertainment for audiences watching from home, but for the people directly involved, they can last for years. Court appearances, depositions, media coverage, public scrutiny, legal expenses, personal attacks, all of it continues long after the cameras stop rolling. Jimmy Kimmel turned back toward Stormy Daniels. If you could erase one part of the last several years, what would it be? She didn't answer immediately. The threats. The audience became completely quiet. Without going into specific allegations or incidents, she explained that intense public controversies can create enormous pressure on everyone connected to them. It's easy for people online, she said. They type one sentence and move on with their day. She looked toward the audience. The people inside the story don't get to move on that quickly. Several audience members applauded. Jimmy Kimmel nodded respectfully. I think that's an important distinction. He wasn't trying to sensationalize the conversation. Instead, he reminded viewers that behind every major political controversy are real people whose lives are affected in different ways. Then he shifted back to Donald Trump. Throughout this entire controversy, Jimmy Kimmel said, President Donald Trump has consistently denied the underlying allegations and has repeatedly described the investigations against him as politically motivated. He paused. That's his position. The audience listened. But here's what keeps bringing everyone back. He gestured toward the stack of documents once more. The legal proceedings didn't disappear. The courtroom hearings continued, the filings continued, the testimony continued, journalists continued reporting, lawyers continued arguing, public interest never seemed to fade. Jimmy Kimmel smiled. It's almost like this story refuses to retire. The audience laughed. Stormy Daniels admitted that living through years of constant headlines had been exhausting. There comes a point, she said, where your name becomes attached to something bigger than your own life. That sentence quieted the room again. She explained that while television often reduced everything to quick jokes or dramatic headlines, the reality involved years of interviews, legal proceedings, public scrutiny, and constant attention. Jimmy Kimmel agreed. We see a headline for 30 seconds, he said. The people inside that headline may spend years living with it. The applause this time was slower and more thoughtful. He then held up another printed statement that had been widely discussed in public reporting. What fascinates me, he said, isn't that people disagree, he paused. It's that every new explanation somehow keeps the story alive. Stormy Daniels nodded. The louder people insisted it was over, she said. The more everyone wanted to know why they kept saying it. The audience reacted with knowing laughter. Jimmy Kimmel smiled. That's one of the oldest rules in politics. He looked directly into the camera. If you tell people not to look behind a curtain, he paused long enough for the audience to anticipate the ending. They immediately want to know what's behind it. The studio erupted. Even Stormy Daniels laughed. The moment broke the tension, but only briefly. Jimmy Kimmel gathered the papers into a neat stack. This isn't really a story about paperwork, he said. It's a story about credibility. Another pause. When public explanations keep changing, people don't stop asking questions. He looked back at Stormy Daniels, and that's why years later we're still sitting here talking about it. The applause echoed through the studio as the camera slowly pulled back. The conversation had reached a turning point. The focus was no longer simply on allegations or headlines. It had become a broader discussion about accountability, public trust, and the lasting consequences of a controversy that refused to fade. But neither Jimmy Kimmel nor Stormy Daniels realized that the most revealing part of the evening and the moment that would dominate headlines the next morning was still waiting just ahead. The applause faded, but the energy inside the studio didn't. Jimmy Kimmel looked down at the stack of papers on his desk before setting them aside. I think we've covered a lot tonight, he said, but I want to end with one simple question. The studio grew quiet. What do you hope people take away from all of this? Stormy Daniels didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a moment to gather her thoughts. I hope people understand that headlines don't tell the whole story, she said. There are real people behind every headline. The audience applauded. She continued, people see a news clip or a social media post that lasts 30 seconds. They don't always see the years of legal proceedings, interviews, public criticism, and personal challenges that come afterward. Jimmy Kimmel nodded. That's probably the part we forget. Stormy Daniels smiled. I think so. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence carried more weight than another joke ever could. Finally, Jimmy Kimmel broke it. You know, he said, history has a funny way of sorting these things out. The audience listened closely. The loudest voices usually aren't the ones history remembers. He paused. The facts are. A wave of applause rolled across the studio. Jimmy Kimmel wasn't declaring winners or losers. He wasn't attempting to settle legal questions from a television stage. Instead, he reflected on something that had defined the entire interview, public records, courtroom proceedings, and the importance of letting evidence, not volume, shape public understanding. He smiled and added, no matter where someone stands politically, accountability matters. The audience responded with one of the loudest applause breaks of the evening. Stormy Daniels agreed. I've learned that you can't control every headline. She shrugged slightly, but eventually people looked beyond the headlines. Jimmy Kimmel leaned back in his chair, and that's where history usually begins. The crowd applauded again. As the interview drew to a close, Jimmy Kimmel thanked Stormy Daniels for joining him. Whether people agree with you, disagree with you, or are still making up their minds, he said, it's important that conversations can happen in public. Stormy Daniels smiled. I appreciate the chance to tell my side. The audience gave her one final round of applause. Jimmy Kimmel turned toward the camera. This story has sparked years of debate, countless opinions, and ongoing legal and political discussions. He smiled, and somehow I have a feeling people will still be talking about it tomorrow. The audience laughed. He wasn't wrong. Within hours, clips from the interview spread across television broadcasts, news websites, and social media platforms. Commentators debated the discussion from every political perspective. Supporters of Trump defended him and argued that the investigations had been unfairly motivated, while critics focused on the legal proceedings and the public record that had unfolded over several years. The interview itself became another chapter in a story that had already lasted far longer than anyone expected. Some viewers remembered the humor. Others remembered the serious moments. Many focused on the broader questions about accountability, public trust, and how modern political controversies continue to shape public conversation long after the original headlines fade. As the credits rolled, Jimmy Kimmel delivered one final line with a grin. One thing I've learned is that the truth doesn't usually disappear just because people stop talking about it. The audience applauded one last time. The lights dimmed, the music began, and the interview ended. But the national conversation surrounding Donald Trump, Stormy Daniels, the legal proceedings, and the questions that had dominated years of headlines continued well beyond the walls of the television studio, reminding viewers that while interviews eventually end, debates over public figures, accountability, and the historical record often continue for years. Jimmy Kimmel kept the conversation moving forward with sharp focus as the interview reached its final stretch. The mood in the studio had shifted completely from light entertainment to a thoughtful exploration of persistence, truth, and public memory. Jimmy Kimmel reminded everyone watching that the controversy involving Donald Trump and Stormy Daniels had outlived countless news cycles, political campaigns, and legal battles. It had become one of those rare stories that refused to fade into the background. Jimmy Kimmel smiled slightly and said that while many scandals burn bright and then disappear, this one had a way of resurfacing whenever new documents, statements, or court developments appeared. The audience nodded along, clearly engaged with the bigger picture Jimmy Kimmel was painting. Stormy Daniels listened carefully and added her perspective with quiet strength. She noted how the constant attention had affected her life in ways most people watching from home probably never considered. Years of headlines, questions, and public scrutiny had turned a private matter into something that followed her everywhere. Stormy Daniels explained that the real weight came not just from the original events, but from everything that followed. The legal fights, the media storm, the personal toll, and the way her name became linked forever to one of the most polarizing figures in American politics. Jimmy Kimmel acknowledged the point and emphasized that this was exactly why the story continued to capture attention. It wasn't only about what may or may not have happened behind closed doors. It was about the public record, the shifting explanations, and the questions that kept arising long after the initial reports. Jimmy Kimmel took a moment to reflect on the broader implications. He pointed out that Donald Trump had maintained his denials throughout, calling the entire matter false and the investigations politically driven. Yet the legal proceedings, court filings, and public testimony had kept the conversation alive for years. Jimmy Kimmel suggested that this persistence was what made the story different from typical political scandals. Every new development seemed to add another layer rather than close the book. The audience responded with thoughtful applause, showing they were absorbing the deeper message Jimmy Kimmel was delivering. Stormy Daniels shared that living with such intense public focus had been exhausting at times. She described how people often reduced complex situations to simple sound bites while those directly involved dealt with the full weight of the consequences. Jimmy Kimmel agreed and noted that television interviews like this one offered a chance to step back and look at the full timeline. From the initial reports to the payments, from Michael Cohen's admissions to the courtroom battles, the story had evolved into something much larger than any single allegation. Jimmy Kimmel highlighted how public trust depended on consistency and transparency, and how repeated changes and explanations naturally led people to keep asking questions. As the conversation wound down, Jimmy Kimmel thanked Stormy Daniels for sitting down and sharing her thoughts so openly. He reminded the audience that while late-night shows were known for humor, moments like this allowed for honest discussions about accountability and the lasting impact of major controversies. Stormy Daniels expressed appreciation for the opportunity to speak directly. The studio audience gave her a warm, sustained round of applause that reflected their respect for the candid exchange. Jimmy Kimmel closed the segment with a final thought directed at the viewers at home. He said that no matter where anyone stood on the political spectrum, stories like this reminded everyone of the importance of public records and the difficulty of making controversies disappear when facts and documents kept surfacing. He smiled and added that history had a way of remembering the details long after the loudest voices had moved on. The audience clapped once more as the lights softened and the music began to play. The interview had started with the familiar energy of a late-night show, but ended on a note of reflection that lingered with everyone watching. In the hours and days that followed, clips from Jimmy Kimmel's conversation with Stormy Daniels spread rapidly across social media and news outlets. Commentators from all sides weighed in. Supporters of Donald Trump criticized the segment as biased and rehashing old claims. Others praised Jimmy Kimmel for focusing on the public record rather than sensationalism. Stormy Daniels' measured responses were widely discussed, with many noting her composure under the spotlight. The interview became yet another chapter in a long-running saga that continued to divide opinions and fuel debate across the country. Jimmy Kimmel had succeeded in doing what few late-night hosts manage, turning a familiar controversy into a fresh conversation about credibility, persistence, and the power of documented facts. Whether viewers ultimately agreed with Stormy Daniels, supported Donald Trump, or remained undecided, the segment left them thinking about how certain stories refuse to fade and what that says about public trust in American politics. The lights went down on the studio, but the discussion sparked by that night was only beginning.